General, it is good to see you. You really should pay attention to your personal files and the politics going on in the Kremlin. Ever since the raising of Chicago, tensions have been rising within these very walls. It seems that our beloved Premier was not consulted ahead of time on the usage of the Midas warhead. Despite what's more disturbing, the High Command's assurances that our Premier Romanov was the one who authorized the strike. Not good, especially so soon after the incident with the Stalin's fist. The exact details aren't yet clear to us, and a lot is still uncertain. I've tried my best to persuade the Premier that you're loyal to the motherland, but for now you're locked out of the weapons protocol. Worry not, however, there are still ways to prove yourself.
The past few weeks had been hectic for Yuri and the Psi Corps, as the destruction of Chicago had thrown a giant wrench into his plans. The psychic amplifier was supposed to be Yuri's crown jewel in America, his greatest contribution to the Soviet war effort thus far. If the device had successfully activated and enslaved the entirety of America, he would have greatly expanded his influence within the Kremlin. With it, he might very well have been able to persuade the High Command into deploying more of his psychic devices across the rest of the world. Europe, Africa, Asia, and before long, a global psychic network would be established, ripe for Yuri's taking when he inevitably betrays the Soviets. But the Americans' retaking of Chicago had shattered all of that possibility into a million pieces. With the key amplifier gone, Yuri had no choice but to drastically alter his plans, and that altering started with the nuking of Chicago. Yes, it was Yuri who mind-controlled Romanov to authorize the nuclear attack on Chicago. Why would he do that, you might ask? Well, let's take a step back and look at the situation from Yuri's perspective. By the time the Battle of Chicago happened, the tides were already beginning to turn against the Soviets, and they had bet all of their chances on the activation of the amplifier. Losing the amplifier would be tantamount to losing the war in America. And well, they did lose the amplifier. So what choices did its destruction leave Yuri with? One might think that the situation is still salvageable, and Yuri could convince the High Command to deploy additional psychic beacons in America to reverse their faltering offensive. But would it be enough to win them the war? The psychic beacon's effectiveness had already been shown to be diminished by the Americans' increasing awareness of its powers, as the pesky Allied commander had demonstrated so easily by destroying the Chicago beacon by the shore. And there's also the possibility of Americans developing new countermeasures to the beacons. Too many questions, too little answers. That was not a risk Yuri was willing to take. And so, only one path remained: the nuking of Chicago, to guarantee the immediate victory of the Soviets on the American continent, and to show the High Command that the Psychic Amplifier project wasn't a fruitless act. In hindsight, this was the correct call. Investigations into a few of the captured American facilities afterwards had revealed hastily deleted schematics of a prototype unmanned laser tank, proving Yuri's concerns valid. If the war had dragged on until something like that gets mass-produced, what then? Ultimately, the decision to annihilate most of the standing US Army had saved Yuri's neck. Yet, as if fate played a cruel joke on Yuri, the usage of the Midas warhead only brought more troubles than boons. The destruction of Chicago had not resulted in surrender from the Americans, but rather a hardening of attitude. And while organized resistance in the US has pretty much fallen apart, legions of militiamen are still tying down most of the Soviet forces in America. Worse still, his manipulation of Romanov had sown distrust within the Russian command chain, as members of the High Command and the Premier himself began accusing each other of deception regarding not only the authorization of the use of the Midas warhead in Chicago, but also the theft of Stalin's fist. Yuri, having just lost much of the favor he had gained with the Russians, was naturally dragged into this discourse as well. Talks of shutting down or breaking up Psi Corps began circulating in the Kremlin. Budget slashes, access restrictions, and significant reduction in operational capability were enacted in the meantime. Reliance on psychic tech was almost immediately toned down in favor of conventional nuclear and cybernetic technology. Most of the Psi Corps staff were relegated to defensive assignments, and any further involvement in large-scale Soviet operations were limited to the deployment of a few troopers at most. His vision to a global psychic network had just been dealt a devastating blow. Despite it all, the great leader would not surrender his cause so easily. To him, all of this was merely a setback. A big one, true, but nothing more. With access to Russian tech completely denied, Yuri has decided to head his bets elsewhere. If he wants to avoid delaying his plans, he must redouble his efforts on strengthening his own army, to procure a tank design of his own, as well as to shift the blame of the theft of the Stalin's fist onto the Allies. Yuri dispatched 2 of his Psi Corps troopers to the coastal city of Primorsk in Leningrad Oblast, Russia. Small skirmishes happened frequently between the Allies and the Soviets in this area, making it the perfect target for Yuri's objectives. Under the command of the proselyte, they snuck into an European outpost in the area and successfully mind-controlled some of their spies. These spies were then used to infiltrate the Russian factories in the area, successfully acquiring the blueprints to the Lasher tank for the Psi Corps, while simultaneously alleviating some suspicion off of them. The tank itself is an old Soviet design, envisioned as a complementary unit for the Rhino tank, ultimately cast off before the Third Great War began, but that means little to Yuri. For Rashidi's modifications would surely breathe new life into it as a crucial part of the Psi Corps' future arsenal.
Danger, proselyte. Your arrival could not have been more timely. The MCV prototype I had been working on was just stolen from us.
Huh?
Speaking of Rashidi, he had been working tirelessly ever since the destruction of the Cairo embassy, and had finally reverse engineered the Stalin's Fist enough that a true original war factory design was completed, and the mobile construction vehicle he had been working on had entered its final prototype stage. Unfortunately, while waging his desert battle against increasingly desperate African-based allies who were chasing them westwards, a crack team slipped in and stole the prototype MCV, and have even managed to unpack it into its construction yard form. Work-wise, this will set them back months if not recaptured, but what's worse is the evidence that's contained within the construct. The Soviets' African expansion efforts have quickened since the rise of the Scorpion Cell, which weakened the local American presence. The fall of USA had accelerated that pace, letting the Soviets rapidly lay claim to much of the regions the US once controlled. One Soviet division in particular had been chasing after the Americans in the area, and was just given the order to attack the base containing the prototype MCV. If they manage to get their hands on it, it won't be hard to find traces of the Stalin's Fist in the design, and from there, it's only a few short steps to connect the dots to Yuri. Fortunately, the proselyte reacted swiftly to the situation. Despite the Allies' numerical advantage and the Soviets following closely behind them, a well-placed strike from the proselyte ensured the disappearance of the MCV and any other evidence that could have jeopardized Yuri. His decisive actions here had earned him the approval of Rashidi, who, luckily, still had the blueprints needed to finish his work without interruption. The Psi Corps soon launched an attack on a vulnerable American base in Sousse, Tunisia, disguising themselves as a Soviet division by borrowing some of their equipment. One may think of this attack as an act of retribution towards the Americans for their earlier actions. The Psi Corps' true objectives here, however, are to gather combat data for the redesigned Lasher tanks, as well as to test the feasibility of the driller as a subterranean ambush transport. To do so, they poisoned the local water supply, severely weakening the US forces stationed in the area. As expected, the Americans, with the Europeans' help, decided to deliver a task force along with an MCV to the area, allowing them to break the siege and rebuild their outpost. With their strength rejuvenated, the Americans overwhelmed the Psi Corps forces in the area and destroyed the excavation site used to poison the waters. Although their timely reinforcements allowed the Americans to temporarily consolidate their positions on the continent, the promising results from the field tests would serve as worthwhile compensation to Yuri. In just a short few weeks, the Psi Corps had drastically increased their level of activity, making great strides towards assembling their own tech tree. But these recent movements are only the beginning of Yuri's shifting strategy, and soon he will stretch his claws eastwards for more. Despite Yuri working his fingers to the bone though, he managed to keep up appearances with the Russians so that they were oblivious to his personal struggles. To them, the situation is much simpler. The destruction of Chicago was indeed a crippling blow to the United States. Yet in spite of the resulting success in the Soviets' campaign, the Americans refused to capitulate. Across the occupied states, governors and civilian militia groups continued to put up resistance. Even in St. Louis, where the psychic beacon under the Soviet general's control presides, there have been reports of insurgency occurring in the area. Which is strange indeed, for even if the range of the beacon is limited, it should still have complete sway over those within its area of effectiveness. The only possible explanation the Soviet intel officers came up with is that there are those who are simply less submissive to mind control. Regardless, with their industrial heartlands gone and the threat of the Midas nuclear warheads ever present, the Americans won't even dare to attempt any large-scale operations lest they suffer another crushing blow to their already dwindling numbers. And the possibility of outside intervention is pretty much non-existent, as the Euro Alliance and the Pacific Front, fearing nuclear retaliation themselves, have refused to send any help to America in even its darkest hours. As a result, the Soviets began dispersing their invasion force in America towards other fronts. with many task forces, such as the one previously under the command of the Soviet general, heading towards the European theater, though a substantial number of troops still remained on the continent, most of whom are serving under the command of Colonel Krukov and Reznov. The duo had elected to stay behind to safeguard the occupation efforts, as well as to direct their invasion against Canada. Most of the Russian naval vessels are still required here to maintain the blockade against any further American attempt to exit the country. The Confederation, on the other hand, is free to send their remaining fleets in the east coast across the Atlantic Ocean to join the attack on Europe. Their forces successfully landed in Muros, Spain, and began their slow advance into Europe. The Chinese, too, began sending forces into Europe, assisting their peers in their conquest while beginning to orchestrate their own in Asia. With America fallen and the Comintern's full might being brought to bear, the Europeans have no choice but to begin making larger movements to counter the Soviet offensive, rallying most of their forces at the German-Polish border to meet the Russian-Chinese coalition head-on. Unfortunately, these drastic strategic movements left an opening for the Soviets to launch their own surprise attack behind European lines. Not a thorough offensive per se, only a warning to the Europeans that their backside is not as safe as they think. Such a task would be perfect for the Soviet general, who, because of concerns over the theft of the Stalin's fist, is currently denied access to most, if not all, Soviet facilities. And so, he led a surprise assault on the French capital of Paris, with the only troops under his command being the legendary heroes Volkov and Chitskoy, resurrected and enhanced to fight for their motherland once again. The fearsome duo stormed their way towards the Eiffel Tower, eliminating the French guards that stood in their path. Upon reaching the tower, Volkov used his Tesla cannon to convert the French monument into a massive Tesla coil. Its electrifying arcs decimated the surrounding Europeans with no remorse, but the rampage was short-lived, as the Eiffel Tower was soon destroyed by a powerful orbital laser strike seemingly fired by the Allied forces. A surprising move, considering the cowardice and indecision the Europeans have shown thus far in the war, but it mattered little to the Soviet general regardless. The laser strike had barely grazed Volkov and Chitskoy, who continued their onslaught against Paris. The duo laid waste to the city before extracting, leaving its denizens, as well as the rest of Europe, trembling in fear of the cyborgs who managed to return from the dead. Despite diverting a substantial number of Euro paratroopers who were supposed to be deployed in the front lines back home to aid in the defense, the move ultimately proved futile, and ironically ended up causing disruptions in troop deployment at the front lines, hastening the advance of the Soviets. Facing mounting pressure from all sides, and with the Midas threat looming over their head like the sword of Damocles, some believe that the fall of Europe is only a matter of time. But all is not lost, as the American Expeditionary Force is still well and present. The remainder of the US Atlantic Fleet had just arrived in Europe, ready to assist with their allies' faltering defense efforts, though they are still bitter from the spineless behaviors displayed by the Euro Alliance and the Pacific Front during their nation's downfall. The Americans understood that infighting is the last thing they need right now, and it is up to them to do better. Recent intelligence from the Pacific Front has pinpointed a facility located on Sakhalin Island, suspected to be the core of the Midas project, a combined mining, enrichment, and production site, much like the Dark Horseman facility from the Second Great War. To sabotage the project, an infiltration team led by Tanya and the Allied commander was sent into the area under the veil of darkness. They captured an old Soviet airfield in the area, using the information gathered there to help them slither their way into the base. The limited intel acquired from the New York Psychic Beacon allowed the Americans to devise a new training program tailored for resisting mind control, though its difficulty meant that only the elite soldiers like Tanya could complete it in such a short time. As a result, however, Tanya was able to easily deal with the Psy Corps troopers spotted among the Soviet patrols in the area. After acquiring intel regarding the whereabouts of Russia's ICBM platforms, the team summarily destroyed the enrichment facility, as well as the invaluable raw materials stored inside the magazines, dealing a crippling blow to Russia's production capability of further Midas warheads. The intel obtained in Sakhalin Island indicated that all 6 of the remaining Midas warheads are located in Gelendzhik Krasnodar Krai, Russia, possibly stored there to prepare for quick strikes against Europe. How fortunate it is for the Allies then, that the location borders the Black Sea, with the Glyfada naval port still in European hands and most of the Russian naval assets committed to the war in America. Nothing will stop an assault on this base by the US Atlantic Fleet. And thus, an immediate plan was devised by the Allies to bring down the Midas threat for good. What must occur is an amphibious assault on the platforms, quick, clean, and decisive. An all-out attack on the facility is out of the question, as the Soviets would spot them from a mile away and start fueling the rockets for immediate launch, which, if they succeed, will end in Armageddon. and a Red's final victory. But under the expert leadership of the Allied commander, a simple strike team could theoretically get the job done before any complications occur. The Allied nations have come to a unilateral conclusion, however, that no chances must be taken for a critical mission like this, one that could very well mean the difference between victory and defeat for all of them. Thus, the Pacific Front agreed to grant usage of their Kanagawa Industries jamming equipment to the Allied commander. And although Tanya's team cannot make their way there in time, the Euro Alliance has offered some of their own forces as reinforcement. A covert ops team was sent in by the shores and began making its way into the base. The team acted with haste, linking up with a sleeper agent in the area to capture the radar dish, crippling the enemy's communications in the area, as well as securing them the exact locations of the Topolem platforms housing the warheads. By using the Pacific Front's jammers to temporarily shut down the Soviet anti-air guns in the area, the Euro Alliance reinforcements were successfully paradropped into the base. The Allied commander wasted no time and began destroying the platforms one after another. The local guards scrambled, desperately trying to get the missiles ready for launch, even causing a misfire in the process. But their efforts were all in vain, for all 6 Topolem platforms were promptly destroyed before they were ready. Although 2 of the 6 platforms carried no warheads for unknown reasons, this is still the first heavy blow the Allies have dealt to the Soviets since the start of the war. With their primary production plant destroyed and all their currently available warheads eliminated, it will take a substantial amount of time before Russia can resume their Midas project. The Euro Alliance rallied to the Americans following this successful mission, seeking cooperation for their defense efforts, as well as providing crucial intel regarding a secret project they've been working on, one which, if completed, could tip the scales irrevocably in their favor.